Greetings, Corpse Clubbers, and welcome to another episode of Corpse Club, the official podcast of DailyDead.com. My name is Heather Wixson, and I am here at Sundance 2020, bringing you a very special interview with a up-and-coming filmmaker whose project really impressed me, and I was like, I really would love to speak with her. So I am joined for this week's episode by Natalie Erika James. Hi, Natalie. How are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
You are very welcome. I know we're a few days into Sundance already. How has this experience been?
Yeah, it's definitely been a whirlwind. It's my first time ever going to Sundance, so just getting my bearings in the first few days it's overwhelming but so exciting at the same time. And there are a lot of nerves leading up to the actual screening and the premiere, but now that that's over, it feels like you can actually enjoy the festival and see some films, which I'm really keen to do. So
have you had any fun celebrity sightings? That's always my favorite part.
Yeah, quite a few. Hey, like they're everywhere. Actually, the funniest thing I feel is the autograph hunters.
Yes.
So you can always spot the celebrities by whoever's getting swarmed by these people who have printouts of the actors, and yeah, it's really impressive. Like how do they know where the actors are going to be? Like, it's almost like they're bird watchers or something, or collectors.
Yeah, I know. I kind of geeked out because I was walking down the street and Mahershala Ali was walking by, and I wanted to be like, oh, I'm so excited you're going to be Blade soon. Like, I was like in awe of him. I was just casually strolling down the road with no security or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, it's so Sundance right now.
Yeah, I know, but that's what I love about the festival. It's so kind of laid back in that way, which is cool.
Yeah. Last year I geeked out hard when I ran into Dr. Ruth.
Oh, who's that? Oh my gosh.
She's here in the States. She was like this like sort of pioneer in terms of talking about like sex and relationships.
Oh, I see.
Through the 70s and the 80s, and she's like this tiny little woman who's like this like spitfire, and I was just like, oh my God, you're Dr. Ruth.
Yeah.
And she's like 4 feet tall, and like she's just a riot. But she had everybody in stitches. But it was just like one of those like everybody else is like, ooh, give me all these big celebrities, and I'm like, ooh, Dr. Ruth.
Yeah. Oh, I will say we were at an interview yesterday where they were kind of like, can we hurry things along because Hillary Clinton's about to walk in.
Oh, okay.
So that was probably the biggest. I didn't see her.
You should have stalled.
I should have.
No, Hillary Clinton's going to wait on me.
I know. So yeah, that was probably the most kind of surreal celebrity.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So I would love to kind of start at the beginning and talk a little bit about your background, because I know when we did our interview before, you mentioned being a horror fan. At what point, like, did you realize? Like, I always feel like there's like this certain moment for anybody who's like creatively inclined. Like, they have this moment where like the light bulb goes off, and they're like, "Oh, this is what I really want to do." And I'm curious, what was your light bulb moment in terms of wanting to direct or be involved with film and things like that?
Yeah. I think. Going way back, like I always loved reading and stories. So I think I'd always had this kind of, deep passion for storytelling to begin with. But I probably discovered cinema, great works of cinema when I was 13 or 14. And that's when I started dabbling with the medium, making really, pretentious, horrible films, as we all do. And what else did I do? I did like a short course as well, so that kind of developed it as well. But it wasn't until I did an art class in high school where I used film as my medium to do all my art pieces, where I really considered film as a career, because up until that point it had always kind of been a hobby. So I would say I had a really, supportive art teacher who kind of pushed me and was like, you should, apply for these film schools in Melbourne. And that was what kind of, put me on the path to making it my career.
Well, I was going to ask, how different is sort of the landscape for aspiring filmmakers, in Australia versus here? Because I know here, like, there's film schools, like, in every major city, or you head to New York or LA or things like that.
Yep.
Is it a lot harder to sort of get into those kind of programs and then sort of take that next step, towards becoming like a quote unquote professional, whatever that even means these days? Yeah.
Well, interestingly, I didn't grow up mostly in Australia. I moved around Asia a lot, going to, international schools, and lived in Japan for, until I was 6. And So maybe it was a little bit different, but I always, because my dad's Australian, I always kind of aim to go to university in Australia. And there are, there's some wonderful film schools there, but I definitely agree it's not as... The industry is much smaller than the States, of course, and it's a much more volatile kind of career path just because of that. And there's a sense in Australia as well that you have to go overseas to be taken seriously as well. So I think, but there's still wonderful things happening back home. And the most amazing thing is that we have a lot of government support and funding, and there are all these amazing programs that kind of bring up emerging filmmakers. So, for example, I did a director's attachment, and that was government funded as well, which gives you basically experience going through a feature when you're in preparation to do your own. So, yeah, there's pros and cons to working in Australia, but certainly the government tries to nurture young talent, and there is a clear sense of that.
That's awesome. It's just interesting to me, like with sort of the way that the industry has opened over here in terms of like streaming and different, ways to view films. Like I feel like we're finally kind of getting a better sense of the filmmaking landscape around the country. And I think especially like Australian filmmaking, like we've seen a lot of really great films coming out over the last few years. And it's exciting for me because I think, I'm all for absorbing stories that I don't really know very well. And I'm curious, were there any sort of filmmakers, like as you were kind of coming up, that you sort of looked to for like inspiration or, just sort of like, like if they can persevere, so can I?
Yeah, I think specifically in Australia, I think the classic examples of that are people like Jane Campion and Gillian Armstrong, of course, is, a very pioneering directors who happen to be female in a time where there weren't a lot of female directors. So those two, of course, you always look up to when you're going through film school. But yeah, I think that like when I was at film school, I went to a school called the VCA, and there were, every year there were or every other year there were Cannes success stories, or the school tended to have some kind of breakout filmmakers. So I think that's always really inspiring as well, when people who are close to your peers are doing well, and you kind of look at that and go, oh hey, like we can all do this. And yeah,
that's awesome. So I'm curious, going into something like Relic, can you sort of walk me through that process initially?
Sure.
Because I know this was something that was very personal for you. And I think it takes a lot to sort of put yourself out there in this way. And can you talk about sort of that process for you of sort of taking that sort of personal narrative, putting it into, this film, and ultimately developing it and moving it towards production?
Yeah, for sure. I think... I guess to give you some history on it, I first came up with the idea back in 2014 even. Okay. So it was a trip that I took to Japan to visit my family over there. And, it was my grandmother who had Alzheimer's. And it was the first trip where she couldn't remember who I was. So there were a lot of feelings of guilt around that. And then in combination with the fact that she lived in this really creepy traditional Japanese house that really scared me as a child. I think the combination of those two things was the seed of the idea. As I recall, I'd written like a very short script out of that, and then with Christian White, my co-writer, we kind of adapted that into a feature from there. And then we had Carver Films come on board, and we decided after that to very consciously make a short film version of the feature script as a proof of concept to make first. And I guess, we went through several rounds of development with Screen Australia, and then we got, our US partners on board. And that's kind of how logically, or rather, what am I trying to say here? I guess the timeline of how the project was developed is, that's what happened. But in terms of using your own personal material, I think that's the beauty of horror, though, that you can, draw on stuff that's very real, but then the genre itself kind of obscures it as well. So as long as you can draw on the emotional truth of it, you can push it further than what it, what real life really is, and almost capture the essence of the experience as opposed to, you know, blow by blow of what happened. I think it can be really emotional at times, pulling personal stuff into your work, but it can also be really cathartic. So there's certainly times where you write and you tear up and it's this emotional kind of thing. But then that also means that you must be hitting on something that's important and meaningful. So I was always really conscious of making sure that I put myself in the audience's shoes in the writing of it, and to make sure that I could really feel it as well. So
I was going to ask, because you mentioned you're doing the proof of concept, you know, and I'm curious for you. To me, it seems like a no-brainer, but I think some people think like, oh, if I have a good script, I can just go out there and get it made. I mean, how essential was it having that short film to be able to prove to folks like, you know, yes, I can do this. This is my vision, and this is where I want to, you know, sort of take the story. Because I think some folks just don't understand that, like, it's almost a necessary thing at this point, I think. Right.
Well, in some ways, it's just you know, they always call it like the calling card or whatever. It just helps it's almost like a shortcut for the investor or whoever it is, the producer, to see what you're going for. And I think for me particularly, it was really useful because it directly led to me being signed by a US agent. And that was really helpful in, you know, piecing together the project. So, you know, we kind of had the Australian side sorted with my Australian producers, but in terms of finding our US producing partners and investors, that was really integral to have a US agent for that. So, yeah, certainly in those discussions when we were kind of shopping the script around, it certainly helped to have the short film to be able to go, hey, this is what I've done, you know, this is what we're going to create, and people could see that and go, yeah, we like that, or whatever. But then at the same time, it was just helpful in my kind of career trajectory to have that calling card and sign with the agency.
That's awesome. Like, I mean, I think because like a lot of people feel like if you're on that part, like over on that side of the world, like it's just how do you even connect with Hollywood? So I think that's really inspiring for somebody who may be listening to this and don't realize like it is possible to, you know, sort of make those connections. Yeah. I mean, because
it was picked up by a few genre festivals, and we happened to get this write-up in IndieWire that was like top 5 films to see at Fantasia or something like that. And then, out of that article directly, people started contacting me. So, it kind of happened over time, but it was pretty incredible. Yeah,
that's excellent. So, moving into production, obviously, you know, you have your cast, you have to do, you know, the production design of the house and everything like that. Can you talk a little bit sort of building your team around this? Because I just felt like there was so many aspects to, I don't even say world necessarily, but the setting of this house really adds so much. It almost becomes a character in itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
And can you talk about sort of kind of putting all those elements together in terms of the team and, you know, kind of moving forward? Like, did you guys have a ton of time? I mean, I'm not sure what the timeline was for you guys.
Yeah, we, you know, there's never enough time, I feel. We had about 6 weeks of pre-production, but we were location wrecking a few weeks before that. Okay. And the house has very specific requirements in the script. So it took us a very long time to find the right house. And in fact, early on, one of our locations fell through. And, you know, if you work backwards from having to like design and build a set, we were behind schedule for most of essentially because of this location falling through. Team-wise, like I was really lucky because I was able to collaborate with my DOP on the short film as well, and he and I had, you know, worked together since just after film school essentially, and we shot a crazy, very low budget short film in Beijing, which was very challenging. So I felt like we'd kind of bonded over this really intense shoot, and we really had a shorthand and just a rapport that I think really made the set because the vibe on set is always top down. And so because me, Charlie Saroff, and our first AD as well were really tight, I felt like it was a really kind of laid back, hardworking, but laid back set, which is how I like to work. Design-wise, my producers from Carver Films had worked with our production designer, Stephen Jones Evans, on a couple other films. So they introduced me to him, and yeah, we just got on really well, and he was really on board with all the ideas and, brought such a wealth of experience, and also, just his own ideas were, I thought, quite extraordinary. So that was wonderful to have, be surrounded by this really experienced production designer who could pull off the challenges of the, pulling together the labyrinth and the stitching the houses together so that they were seamless and feeling like one house. And then this, collaborator who I'd gone to war with previously with my DOP. So yeah, it was a really great team. And then prosthetics wise, we had a prosthetics artist who assembled the most amazing kind of sculpting team. And I met him when I was shadowing Lee Winnell on his film Upgrade. So he did all the prosthetics for Upgrade as well.
So wait, so you were on Upgrade?
Oh, right. So I,
you know Lee. Okay.
Right.
Okay. Because I actually, his wife was in one of my not one of mine, the only short film I ever did, but I've been friends with them for years and years now.
That's so funny. Yeah.
No, I never want to assume like when somebody's from like the same country, be like, obviously you know Lee Winnell, right? Because everybody knows, if you're from Australia, you know who, you know him, right?
Yeah.
So that's awesome.
Yeah. So it was just the that government program I was talking about before. So they, basically pay for you to shadow a director. So I followed Lee around for 3 months. And,
oh wow.
Yeah. Drove him to set and stuff, and yeah, he was very generous with his time and advice and that kind of thing. So
that's really cool.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But yeah, those are kind of the key collaborators, I suppose. And then of course, I could go on and on about my wonderful composer and sound designer and all that kind of thing. But
yeah, well, you mentioned obviously your production designer, and I think that one of my favorite aspects of this is that they really get. And I say this lovingly because my grandmother was the same way, but like the old lady clutter, where it's like you just feel like there's generations of things.
Totally.
And after my grandfather passed away and my grandmother was living in this house by herself, and we're like, we have to get her out of there, we have to move her and stuff. Yeah. And it was just like the things that we were finding, and it was like stuff from the 60s, the 70s, 100%. The 80s, and like the 90s, and
the
I'm like
hoarding as well. My grandmother had a real problem with that, and yeah, she'd get really upset if you tried to throw away like just packaging or something.
Because it was wasteful, right?
Or something. Or part of it's that kind of wartime scarcity mindset, but also, just attaching significance to things that weren't necessarily, there's kind of like a disconnect there where they just, it feels like they want to. Robyn and I talked about this a bit, the fact that like the hoarding has something to do with like, keeping your memories, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But no, I thought he did such a fantastic job.
He really did.
Because it was like, I was like, wow, it's like sometimes like you'll watch a movie and you just kind of feel like, okay, so I'm watching like a house that's been set for a movie. Yeah. It's just the appropriate amount of things.
Completely.
And I just felt like there was like layers to the things that he was doing that really added so much to that atmosphere.
His attention to detail was amazing. And he said to me at one point, the hardest thing to set design is actually, or set dress is clutter. Just like bits and bobs and make it feel natural. So for him, he had a ton of references and, because it's all just collecting stuff. So I know for him, the authenticity was 100% important.
Yeah, well, he absolutely nails it. And I'd love to sort of talk about your three women who are the heart of this movie. And I think for me, that's what I really loved is sort of you have these basically three generation of women who, are dealing with this scenario in their own their own ways. Can you talk a little about sort of the casting process for you and in terms of, what it was you saw in them and what they brought to their respective roles? Because I also want to commend you because I really loved there's that natural relationship because I somebody who grew up idolizing my grandmother.
Yeah.
And my mom and I always had conflict.
Yeah.
And there's some really things in this movie that just rang so true for me. Where I was like, as the kids say, like, I felt seen in that moment. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I also thought in particular, the scene where she gives her the ring and then doesn't remember, there was an incident like that happened. And I was like, it gets scary. But I think these, Emily and Robert and Bella, like, they're just so good in this. And I'm more familiar with Bella and with Emily, but I didn't feel like I was watching actresses. I felt like I was watching a family.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful to hear. I agree. I think it's a really common trend for, the kind of tension between parent and child to skip a generation. Yeah. Because it's not that immediate kind of, they haven't had to like discipline you as a teenager or whatever it is. So
and deal with all your shenanigans.
Right. So there's just such a, often the relationship is just so full of like an uncomplicated love. Whereas with, the mother and the grandmother and Bella and Emily's character, there's just so much shit, and history and unresolved, resentments and all that fun stuff that we all have. It's a really interesting question. I think Robyn in particular is, just a force. Like if you meet her, I felt like she's a real. We often call her like a national treasure because in Australia she is kind of considered the queen of theatre. She used to run the Sydney Theatre Company, and I loved when I met her. I loved the fact that she was so sharp and so witty and clever. There's such a spark to her. I just feel like she's such a force, and there's a real charm to her. But she's also has this she can flip really easily, and you see that in the film. This kind of this anger that kind of wells up, and she kind of just flips a switch. So I kind of loved the double-edged kind of the softness and the charm of the grandmother character, but then also the kind of the sinister undertone that I just found her to be her range for showing vulnerability, but then also kind of flipping that into something sharper was incredible. So and then with Bella, I think previously she kind of if you look at her previous films, she tends to be cast in very feminine, kind of more softer roles. And when I met her in LA, she was just the most down-to-earth, Australian kind of chick. And so right for the character, who's like slightly boyish. And Sam, in particular, is kind of at a crossroads in her life where she's about to hit 30 and she hasn't really figured out what she wants to do. And, she's kind of grounded by this intense love for her grandmother and that relationship. And she feels like her mother she's just got this kind of fraught, I guess simmering resentment kind of relationship with her mother. So yeah, I felt like, I don't know, when you meet an actor and you can tell that they really understand the script and the character in a way that is going to ring true on screen. It was kind of an easy decision in that way. And similarly, Emily, I think, when you read Kay's character on the page, she comes across, people often have this feedback about Kay being too harsh or too cold, or, the one who's focused on her work and her ambitions as opposed to family. And when you think about someone like Emily Mortimer, that's not really, they're not really synonymous kind of images in your mind. And I was really interested in that contrast because I think Emily just brings such a humanity to the character, and the audience is kind of instantly aligned with her. I'm sure it varies from watch to watch, but I feel like for me watching the film like 2 nights ago, I felt the most kind of, I feel like the story is told through her character and her problems first and foremost, I think.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting too is the way that a lot of this sort of is centered on her conflict. And I think, there's a group of us, as our parents are getting older, that we're feeling that. We're like, like right now, like I live in LA. My mom lives in Virginia. She's going to be 68 this year.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, she's still good and she's got family out there and everything. But I'm like, there's that conflict of like, well, if something happens, like, what do I do to deal with it?
Completely.
And I think I think there was a lot that Emily brought to sort of that conflict that Kay feels that I really appreciated, because you weren't demonizing her decisions of like having to look at a home and then going back and forth and trying to figure out what's sort of rational. Because ultimately, like, whether it's here or whether, anywhere in the world, I think our society is almost so broken at this point where it's like, it's almost impossible to care for your family at a certain point, because it's just everything is revolved around your jobs and things like that, and there's no escape. And I'm curious, was it conscientious for you to sort of work in this like little bit of a statement in terms of sort of those familiar responsibilities we have, but ultimately, we still have jobs, we still have lives, we still have things we have to take care of, because it's tough. Like, I can't even imagine how people, do it. And then do it with having kids too.
Well, that's right. And I think Christian and I never wanted to present a very black and white answer, to that particular problem. And it was interesting in the writing process, because I think it's like a bit of a cliche, or maybe it's slightly outdated, this idea that like nursing home equals bad. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because it's not that simple. And during the course of writing the film, we both happened to have sets of grandparents who went into nursing homes. And a lot of that was coming from themselves and not wanting to be, necessarily looked after, day to day by their own children. It's like it can be like a conscious choice on their part too. And so, we didn't want to, I think this scene in the nursing home there's a sadness to it, but particularly because it's kind of presenting a ward of the nursing home with dementia patients, and a sense that, there's a sadness. I think the sadness comes from the fact that it's probably going to be the last place that they live in. Know?
Well, there's a discent, I think, that comes when they're taken out of their natural sort of place and put into somewhere new.
Yes, thank you for saying.
You're welcome.
My brain is not working at this hour.
I don't know why. You have had nothing going on for the last few days.
But so the scene kind of plays in a somber way, but it certainly wasn't our intention to just go, you're a bad person if you don't look after your parents, in a very immediate sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, ultimately, I want to keep this vague, obviously, because I don't want to go into spoilers. But the way that sort of everything culminates in this is really beautiful in a way that, I wasn't expecting. Like, I don't know what I was expecting, but like, I didn't expect to be emotional towards the end. And it did. And we were talking earlier that I was chatting online with Megan Navarro from Bloody Disgusting.
Oh yeah, great.
And we both talked about how we pretty much ugly cried at the end of this movie. And I think it's a really nice thing when you can take a movie that has horror elements, has dramatic elements, but ultimately you can give it sort of this emotional gut punch. And I'm curious for you, were there ever any challenges in terms of balancing that tone? Or did it just, because of the script that you and Christian did it all just kind of flow naturally, from the start?
I think one of our biggest tonal references was a film like The Orphanage, Jay Bayona's beautiful film, which, has this emotional through line. And you cry at the end, but has those scares. It's so tricky balancing the two, I think, just to make sure that it has enough of the horror kind of framework present throughout, and it still stays true to the characters' motivations and the development of that, the dramatic kind of plot. So I think, yeah, for sure, because, if you focus too much, it's a balancing act, because if you you don't do right by the overall film if you just kind of shoehorn these kind of horror set pieces in. It always feels to me like a very writer thing to do, to kind of, push it in there. So yeah, a lot of it was about restraint. And, it's tricky with this film because the horror is kind of in the anticipation of what's to come. And there's a lot that's pulled back, and there's a lot of moments that build up, and then, nothing's forthcoming, right? And that is a conscious thing, but it's not like we have a physical ghost that appears, or you know what I mean. So it was a conscious thing. It was certainly a challenge, but we tried to kind of straddle both in a way that hopefully appeals to not only just horror fans, but also kind of a broader audience as well. The flip side, of course, is that it's not full of cheap thrills. And so, yeah, I'm sure some people will be disappointed if they're, looking for like a Halloween film to put on, and yeah.
But they can just go watch Halloween then.
Yeah.
That's always an option.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm curious, just because I'm a big believer in whenever you do something creative, like, you obviously put something into it and you take something away from it. And looking at the experience of being able, to make Relic, be able to take it, to festivals and things like that. What has been sort of your biggest takeaway from this entire experience?
Oh, yeah, good question. Big question.
I like to throw the really heavy loaded questions at the end once you're really tired. And
I mean, yeah, I think the biggest thing, and this might be really cheesy, but for me, you spend, so as I said before, I've wanted to be a filmmaker since I was 13. You spend 3 years going to university. You spend years and years making your own stuff, putting your own money into your short films, investing in yourself, all that kind of thing. And then you finally come to directing the film. And for me, the most gratifying feeling was being on set, going through it and actually thinking, oh, wow, now that I'm here, this is definitely what I want to do for the rest of my life. So for me, I think that was the most validating kind of epiphany of the whole experience, that despite all the challenges and the headaches of just the logistics of making a film, and the self-doubt and all the emotions that you go through when you're, driving this, multi-million-dollar ship for the first time, the fact that, you can still look back and say, and, feel validated in your career path or what you're doing with your life. I think that was, that was the biggest thing for me.
Excellent. So I'm curious, what comes next? Like, is it still just writing out Relic for a while, or are you already have irons in the fire?
Yeah, my Australian producers are cracking the whip. We have another project called Drumwave that's we're about to start the second draft, and that's a Japanese folk horror.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Which will be really fun. And it's cool. It's kind of like a Wicker Man meets Rosemary's Baby kind of vibe, all about the sacrifices required for motherhood, and selfhood versus motherhood, and really for me just the very visceral fear of pregnancy and giving birth in general. So there's that one. And then I'm writing 2 other scripts. One's a demon horror set in LA, and one's a body horror set in New York. So they're all kind of horror,
That's exciting.
Subsets. Yeah. Yeah. Seems to be the way my brain works. So
that's awesome. Well, I feel like, it's great to get to speak with you now, because I feel like in a few years when we catch up, like, your life is going to be so different, and it's going to be like, you're going to be on a completely different level. And like, you may not even have time to have to do these kind of talks.
Not at all.
But I think it's really exciting when you see new talent kind of coming into the fold, and you can recognize that there's something special to them. And I'm not just saying that because we're talking, but I really, when I saw this film, like I had a conversation with your publicist originally, and I was like, okay, I was already immediately hooked because of the premise. And then I saw what you did with this film, and I was like, my God, this is like somebody's in my soul making a horror movie about these things that, I think we all have sort of dealt with at one point or another. But it's just been, it's been a real pleasure to like get to see, this film get embraced at Sundance, and I'm really excited to see what you get to do next. I just think it's only going to be bigger and better from here.
Oh my gosh, I've got shivers. Thank you so much. That's so lovely of you. Thank you.
Well, do you have like a site or anywhere like people can find you? That way they can keep tabs on you in the future?
Yeah, I probably my Instagram is my best, most updated source. Which is just Natalie James on Instagram. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Natalie, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat, especially when I know you're so busy here at the festival. And for those of you listening, thank you so much for supporting Corpse Club. I really appreciate it. I think we all do here at Daily Dead. To find out more about Corpse Club, you can visit us over at corpseclub.com. For all your news and reviews and interviews and fun stuff like that, you can head over to dailydead.com. But again, Natalie, this has been a super duper huge pleasure for me. So thank you again for being here. And for those of you listening, until next time, stay scary.